We're reading from the Gospel of St. Mark. St. Mark is all about discipleship. Not much about the rewards of discipleship. According to St. Mark, the reward of being a disciple comes from the doing of it. You can't really talk about it. A little bit about the cost of discipleship, which we heard last week, also in the 10th chapter, when some of the disciples came to Jesus and started complaining. Imagine people in church complaining. But they came to Jesus and they said, Jesus, we've given up everything. We've given up farms and family and possessions to follow you, and where's the payoff? And Jesus says, I hear you. Indeed, you have given up farms and family and possessions, but I guarantee you, you will receive farms, family, possessions 100-fold, along with persecutions. Now, the church has always interpreted that response by Jesus in a spiritual way when he says to the disciples, you will receive farms 100-fold. He's not talking about agricultural acreage. He's talking about an area of expertise. Every disciple has a gift. And part of discipleship is the uncovering of that baptismal gift. For some, it's reaching out to the poor, to feed them, to clothe them, to house them. That really becomes their area of expertise. They've received that area 100-fold. Others, it's studying the scriptures. For others, it's prayer. But every disciple will receive a gift, has already received a gift, and it will multiply innumerably as discipleship is practiced. You will receive family. They've given up their families, and in the first century, that was a serious thing to do, to turn your back on the family traditional religion and go off in a new direction. Some of them were read out of the family, but Jesus says you will be rewarded with a new family, a family of believers. People who will surround you in the good times and the troubled times and at the end. And what's more, in another place Jesus says, that family is eternal. That family is forever. It never goes away. Next week, when we celebrate All Saints Sunday, the community of all the saints, the communion of all the faithful, we're celebrating the eternal nature of Christ's family. Militant on earth, struggling to make it through the next day, to take the next spiritual hill, and triumphant in heaven. That family they receive big time. And the possessions they receive, well, they won't be those kind of possessions that we can insure and stuff in the closet and regift maybe or anything like that. They are internal possessions, aren't they? They're possessions of the Spirit and of the heart that each disciple knows about and treasures. And again, these survive. These are forever. You will receive those things, and you will receive them 100-fold, promises Jesus. And the disciples take comfort in those words as they look with a little green bit of envy at all the riches around them in which they are not sharing. But now St. Mark is on to something else. St. Mark wrote his gospel 30, 40 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And he wrote it to be a primer for disciples. Not to be a report of what happened 40 years ago, but to take what happened 40 years ago, organize it in such a way that disciples today, in 68 AD or in 2012 AD, can take the book and use it as a guide for the way to be a disciple, the practice of discipleship. That's what St. Mark is really interested in. And so this story here of blind Bartimaeus. Significant that it happens in Jericho. Jericho was and is the entry point into the part of Jerusalem, part of Israel that's called Judea. Jesus has traveled from the Galilee, his home area. He's gone to the east of the Jordan. Now he's crossed the Jordan at Jericho, where people still cross. He meets there, in a crowd of people, a blind man called Bartimaeus. And you heard the story. He heals Bartimaeus of his blindness. But St. Mark really shows us there's so much more to it. To begin with, he shows us that Jesus would have been the world's worst campaigner for political office. If you compare, Jesus travels from the Galilee up to Jerusalem, which is where he's headed, and Jericho is just a stop on the way. You compare that to the current political campaigns, they're nothing alike, are they? Our current campaigners travel everywhere too. But just picture Jesus in a swing state, and he's on his bus, and his handlers, Peter, James, and John, say, okay, we've scheduled you for a speech at 10 o'clock. It's now 5 of 10. You'll go up there on the stage, and you'll really let him have it. So Jesus steps off the bus, and just as he's about to go off and get onto the stage, he sees someone along the side of the road, and he stops. And that's what it says here. Jesus stood still. Our political candidates never stand still. You notice that? They're always moving. Oh, how do you do? Oh, how do you do? Always shaking my hand, looking over my shoulder to see if somebody more important is behind me. You know, I love it, don't you? They kind of let you know when your time is up, you know. Not so Jesus. That person's time is never up. And so it says Jesus stood still. He stood still, standing in front of Bartimaeus. Whatever kind of miracle Jesus performed, anywhere in the Bible, healing of the blind or the lame or the deaf or whatever, the message was always the same. Not in words, but in action. The message was, you count. You have value. You matter. And another place, he really puts a fine point to it. He says, you know, my friends, every hair of your head is counted. Every little bird that falls in the forest that nobody sees, your Father in heaven sees. Nothing is ever lost. In his last great prayer in the Gospel of St. John, where Jesus kneels down before the crucifixion, he offers up this prayer and he says, Father, I thank you for many things, but I thank you mainly that of all that you've given me, nothing has been lost. Nothing is lost. Not the hairs, not the birds, not the disciples, not the people who came and decided they couldn't do it and left. They haven't been lost either. No one is ever lost. You count. You are valuable. Jesus stood still, and of course he was late for his appointment. All right, he moves on, and Bartimaeus comes to him. And as they're standing there, he says to the blind man, what would you have? And he says, I would have my sight. And so Jesus restores his sight. He not only restores his sight, but as we'll hear in just a moment, he gives him a whole new optical system. For Bartimaeus learns to see in an entirely new way. Not only can he see the trees and the birds and the street signs and things, the astigmatism of the world is all gone. And things have come into focus he's never seen before. He sees deeper. He sees farther. He kind of gets it for the first time, does Bartimaeus. He not only observes now, he understands. He sees. Well, St. Mark says, once that happened, throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. Wow. That sounds triumphant, doesn't it? Throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. But if we really look at it closely, he did it wrong. You and I wouldn't have done it that way. Throwing off his cloak, he sprang up and came to Jesus. We would stand up first and in the process probably lose our cloak. You know, just the force of standing up might throw our overcoat off. But not Bartimaeus. Instead, he threw off his coat first. St. Mark is reminding us that's what it takes to be a disciple. We have to get rid of everything first. Then we can spring up, for the gospel's high. The standards of the gospel are high. To spring up to them requires a leap. You can't leap over a gap. You can't leap high. If you are encumbered, you throw off the coat. Throw off all those regrets, all those sins, all those memories that are weighing you down. Throw them all off first. And then watch what happens. Spring up. Spring up and come to Jesus. So there they are. Jesus is standing still. And now Bartimaeus is standing in a different place. No longer sitting down in the dust, weighed down with his heavy coat, all the stuff that used to keep him cozy, no longer there. He's off the ground, and he's eye to eye with his Lord. And what does Jesus say to him next? Bartimaeus, go. Your faith has made you well. Go on your way. Your faith has made you well. Bartimaeus disobeys Jesus here. He says to himself, does Bartimaeus, I'm not going to go on my way. My way bores me now. My way holds no interest for me whatsoever. I want to go on his way. I want to go on your way. Well, Jesus' way, there was only one way left for Jesus. There's not much time. He's on his way from Jericho up to Jerusalem. It's near the end. He's going to go the way of the cross, the way of sorrows, the Via Dolorosa. That's the way. And so Bartimaeus makes a choice here, not to go his own way, but to go Jesus' way. So he follows Jesus. And in our imaginations, we can kind of see him going up behind Jesus through the gates into Jerusalem. Now that's the last we hear of Bartimaeus in the Bible. There's no more. But one of the wonderful things about the Bible is that because it doesn't lay out everything in detail, it invites you and me to employ our imaginations and to really get going. I've put in your bulletin this morning a poem by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow. And I invite you now to read this with me about blind Bartimaeus. The poet has used his imagination to pick up where the story in St. Mark has left off. Let's read it together. Blind Bartimaeus at the gates of Jericho in darkness waits. He hears the crowd, he hears a breath say, it is Christ of Nazareth, and calls in tones of agony, Jesus, have mercy now on me. The thronging multitudes increase. Blind Bartimaeus, hold thy peace. But still above the noisy crowd, the beggars' cry is shrill and loud until they say, He calleth thee. Fear not, arise, he calleth thee. Then saith the Christ, as silent stands, the crowd, what wilt thou at my hands? And he replies, So give me light. Rabbi, restore the blind man's sight. And Jesus answers, Go in peace. Thy faith from blindness gives release. Ye that have eyes yet cannot see, in darkness and in misery, recall those mighty voices three. Jesus, have mercy now on me. Fear not, arise and go in peace. Thy faith from blindness gives release. Let's build on Longfellow and use our own imaginations. And now let's imagine Bartimaeus inside the city gates of Jerusalem. It's Holy Week. He's followed Jesus on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, Thursday even, and on Friday, after the trial, after the condemnation, Jesus is led out by the soldiers mid-morning, and they're on the way to the crucifixion. Simon Cyrene has the cross because it's too heavy for Jesus. And they're all following, small entourage, and there are probably crowds along the side of the Via watching to see what will happen, although they know what will happen. And as they're walking along, Bartimaeus sees somebody on the side of the road who catches his attention. You can see it in the face. It's a person in need. And Bartimaeus turns to that person. He stands still, as Jesus had stood still for him. He stands still, and as he stands there listening to the story of that person, he loses track of time. He doesn't know where he is, except he's there. He's there present with that person. What a rare thing, but a thing that the disciple of Christ must perfect. When finally the conversation is over, it's late. And Bartimaeus looks around, and Jesus and the soldiers and the entourage are long gone. And the crucifixion is over, and the excitement has thinned the crowds. Life is back to normal. No one remembers. Bartimaeus stands there all by himself on the paving stones of Jerusalem, wondering what to do next. As he stands there, in our imaginations, we can think that Bartimaeus hears a voice inside his soul saying, Bartimaeus,